So, Yarman I hope you're well today. My name's Alison Barnes, and I am a proud Wiradjuri woman. Welcome to this series of short videos looking at housing and home for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here in Australia. Oh, so many words. So before we get going, I'd like to offer an acknowledgement of country, and in doing so, acknowledge the Darug and Gundungurra people, who are the traditional custodians of the country I'm sitting on today, here in the beautiful Blue Mountains, just west of Sydney. I'd like to thank them for their ongoing connection to and care for country, waterways and community, and thank them for their open and welcoming us, my family and I, into their community. So today we are looking at the United Nations Direct Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which is also known as UNDRIP. UNDRIP is an international instrument that affirms the human rights of Indigenous people around the world. It's a framework to ensure survival, dignity and well-being. However, UNDRIP is not legally binding, which is a bit of a shame. So UNDRIP was adopted in 2007. It's a non-legally binding UN resolution. This happened after decades of negotiation that included many Australian First Nations people. It was finally endorsed by Australia in 2009, so it took a minute. But it's not law. There's no national action plan, no auditing of existing laws, no policies to ensure compliance with UNDRIP, and there's no requirement to ensure that future laws and policies comply with UNDRIP. In 2017, when Australia was lobbying for a seat on the UN Human Rights Council, our endorsement of UNDRIP was put forward as a aren't we fabulous kind of moment. But people on the Human Rights Council did notice that despite endorsement, it's not legally binding here in Australia, any aspect of this. The Australian Human Rights Report in 2021 showed it was still not legally binding in any way, shape or form here in Australia. And Senate inquiry in 2022 showed the same thing. Yeah. So kind of disappointing. You would have hoped for more. UNDRIP provides protection for both individual and collective rights for First Nations people right around the world, provided it's adopted into law, not just a principle. There are 4 principles that pillar UNDRIP: self-determination, decision-making, protection of culture, equity and discrimination. And these principles cover a range of things: health, housing, education, and some practical ways which nation states can work with Indigenous people to ensure their survival. We're going to look at housing as an example because this whole thing is about housing. UNDRIP mentions housing twice in Article 21.1 and 21.2 and in Article 23. And in both instances, it's about economic and social conditions. And Section 2 of Article 21 imposes obligations on the state to make sure that special measures are enacted to ensure continuing improvement of economic and social conditions in these areas. Article 23 references housing by saying that Indigenous people have the right to determine and develop priorities and strategies for exercising their right to be actively involved in developing and determining health, housing, and other economic and social programs affecting them as far as possible, and to administer such programs through their own institutions. Now, recently, in the last 5 years, there was a court case in the Northern Territory where people from the former mission of Santa Teresa, it does have a language name. I'm not going to try to say it because I'm not very good at languages. Anyway, Santa Teresa, people from there took the Northern Territory government to court, claiming that their housing was not fit for purpose. It had problems with a regular electricity supply. They had problems with sanitation. They had problems with the housing just breaking around them. And they won. Surprise, surprise. The Northern Territory government then countersued by claiming that as the landlord, they didn't have to do these repairs because the Aboriginal people who lived there hadn't been paying rent. I mean, honestly, that decision was not upheld. That claim was not found to be true. So they had to do something about fixing the housing in Santa Teresa. I mean, honestly. I've never been to Santa Teresa, but my mum and dad used to go quite a bit and to visit friends. And Dad tells me that people were right to do that sort of stuff. He went there once. He's now in his 80s. So he would have been in his late 70s at the last time he went. And when he was there, he had to help fix the generator. He is an electrician, but, you know, a retired, from an electrical engineer by trade. That's not a sustainable way of maintaining a township's electricity supply. Waiting for the old dude to come visit. Anyway, so this is one way that Aboriginal people have stood up to governments and as their landlord and said, this is not on. Since the intervention back in the John Howard era, we've been hearing about the terrible housing and conditions for housing in remote townships in the Northern Territory. They don't do anything about it. And they throw a lot of money at the problem. I won't. It's a whole different story. Anyway, that seems to be the end. So bonus points if you can spot a familiar house in this row down the bottom. Just, you know, just in case. So that's your lot for today, or for this talk. I will say Guayu, which in Wiradjuri means see you next time. Safe travels until we meet again. Guayu.